Yeah, like you've actually already segued there too. So let's do that as we actually jump into part two of our series. Once again, too, you're hanging with Kit and Faran too. This is a row from Emmaus. If you did not catch part one, please go back and review that. Part two, we're actually going to pivot right now and talk about the prophetic themes and how Yahweh, through the prophets, is essentially speaking on behalf of their judgment, their indictment, and ultimately how he's going to resolve this issue, which emerged going back to the garden. Okay, we have four key parts we want to unpack over the next several minutes, too. The first one is the writing prophets, too, that emerged after the division of David's kingdom. Talk a little bit about their audience, their message, and then kind of some of these key terms that we need to understand: pre-exile, exile, post-exile, and how they help us understand how these things are funneling towards their resolution.
Right. Well, like with everything, it's important to read the prophets, the prophetic scriptures in their own historical and salvation historical context, according to their original audience and what's really being gotten at. It's easy for us to think prophets give us prophecy, and therefore I read these prophets as if what they're saying is God's promise to me, or a prophecy about what's going to happen in my generation, or what's going to happen in America, or whatever it happens to be. And we can't read them in that sort of a way. That's to strip them from their actual context. So, as you mentioned, what we call the writing prophets are the prophets who have actual contribution to the Old Testament scriptures. There were other prophets like Elijah and Elisha and many others who don't have a book, or the prophecy of Elijah in the scriptures. We don't have that. So when we say writing prophets, we're talking about the Isaiahs and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, the 12 minor prophets, as we call them. And they did, as you said, they came into the picture in the centuries following the division of David's kingdom. And because the division of David's kingdom was a crucial step towards both of those two sub-kingdoms. David's kingdom was divided into Israel in the north, 10 tribes, Judah in the south, 2 tribes. And both of those sub-kingdoms were on their own trajectory towards conquest, destruction, exile, and captivity. And they happened at different times, but both kingdoms were headed towards that same outcome. And the writing prophets emerged during that point, that time in history, that season in history. And so they very much focused on this idea. The earliest of those writing prophets, they focused on the idea of coming exile. And then you have some of the prophets who God raised up during the time of that exile, the time in Babylon, the time even shortly, when they returned. And they were often called, we refer to them as the exilic prophets, or the prophets of the exile. And then you have other prophets who, the last of the writing prophets, who God raised up after those Judean exiles came back. The Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi, those we call the post-exile prophets. But the point of that is to say that all of the prophets were concerned about speaking to this issue of the exile of the Abrahamic people, whether looking to it coming or sitting in the middle of it, or even after the recovery and saying, wait a minute, you need to understand this issue of exile properly. So they were all focused on that particular thing in 2 directions or 2 dimensions. Number one, they spoke to why this was going to happen, why exile was coming, why it had happened, what was really the reason behind this, what was Yahweh doing in creating this outcome. But then the second piece was to say, but this will not be the last word. If you will, the destruction, or not entirely destroyed, but the complete undoing of the Abrahamic household is not going to be the last word. Why will it not be the last word? Because God made an oath to Abraham. God pledged that through Abraham and his descendants, he would gather the whole world back to himself. So this can't be the end of the Abrahamic people. And God also pledged to David that he would raise up a son of his and he would reestablish David's house and throne and kingdom in that son. And in that way, Yahweh would establish his own kingdom so as to become king over all the earth. And so, therefore, again, what's happened to Israel and Judah, the end of the Abrahamic family in exile, can't be the last word. And that's what the prophets are focusing on. And to the extent that they now begin to talk about this coming Messiah, it's in that context. This Messiah is a figure who is associated with God addressing this problem of exile, bringing about regathering, renewal, bringing about the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham and David. And interestingly, and I'll end with this at this point. This is why you see Matthew in his gospel. He begins by introducing Jesus as the Messiah, as the son of Abraham, the son of David. He's not just tracing out a biological genealogy. He's tying this person, Jesus of Nazareth, to that, again, promise of an Abrahamic son, promise of a Davidic son, which is very important in establishing him as indeed the Messiah that God's been promising.
Building on that idea, too, something else that we see in terms of the prophetic themes is the covenantal context, and that Yahweh's sword is wielded against David's unfaithful house. What are some key things, too, as we start to transition towards Jesus' birth that our listeners and watchers need to understand in terms of that sword, its impact, and obviously how that helps set the stage for the incarnation?
Well, once again, the prophets are interpreters of Israel's circumstance. And so they both look backwards, they deal with the present, and they deal with the future. And effectively what they do is they call to remembrance. They call whether it's Judah in the south or Israel in the north, whoever these prophets particularly minister within the household of Israel, the Israelite people, they draw in they remind Israel of its past. And that's always kind of covenantal. Do you remember? This is who you are. God brought you out of Egypt. He did this. Remember, remember, remember. And both their covenant status and identity and calling, and then also their unfaithfulness to that. You have broken the covenant. You have been harlotrous. You have been unfaithful sons. And that has brought you to this circumstance of exile. You have to remember how you got here. Why did Yahweh depart? Why did he send you away? Why are you suffering in this affliction, in this agonizing exile and oppression? Why has this happened? Why has everything been made desolate? And then they also look to the future and say, but here's where this is going to go. This is what the Lord is ultimately doing. And so they themselves exist within a covenantal context, right? The prophets all emerge in Israel in the context of the law of Moses. They emerge within this Israelite Sinai context, which itself is, again, the confirming of the Abrahamic identity, covenant status, covenant obligation to the people of Israel. So as they call the people to repentance and indict them for their unfaithfulness and warn them and then even extend hope to them of what's coming, it's all set within this larger covenant context of you have been unfaithful to the covenant by which your Abrahamic identity and calling are established. But at the same time, this covenant intent of God will stand. And because God is a covenant-keeping God, this will see God ultimately resolving this calamity that's come upon you as covenant breakers. God is the covenant keeper. And this gets us a little bit further down the road, but I think it's important for people to understand, and I've stressed this with our own congregation, that the new covenant is not a New Testament concept. It's an Old Testament concept. The promise of a new covenant, though, in the Old Testament is the promise of covenant renewal. God will renew his relationship with the Abrahamic people, and in that way, he will renew the covenant. It's not the renewal of Sinai, in some kind of, like, again, moral law sort of way. It's not that. It's that what God has bound up in Abraham and that has gone so terribly wrong, God will be faithful to that. He will renew the covenant by renewing the relationship with the Abrahamic people through forgiveness, through cleansing. He will cause Israel to be Israel indeed. And this becomes the way in which we need to understand even the new covenant. And that's going to take us down the road. But all of the prophets are speaking in a context of Israel's covenant relationship with God. So their message is a covenantal message. And again, the sword of Yahweh has brought things to where they are because of their unfaithfulness, their failure to be son of God in truth.
Yeah, what did Yahweh's oaths to Abraham and David add to the equation? I know we've spent a lot of times, I know just even a lot of casual observers of scripture are very familiar with those names, those characters, for lack of better terms.
Right.
But in particular, what did his oaths to Abraham and David in particular add to the salvation historic narrative? And then more importantly, how did that advance it and move us towards where we're getting to in terms of the incarnation?
Well, I mean, David and Abraham are kind of the central figures in the Old Testament narrative as kind of focal points in God's covenant dealings in the world unto accomplishing this cosmic goal. And as we've said, Abraham is the one man that God picks out of the world to be the human instrument for bringing his blessing to all the families of the earth. And so Abram is this tip of the spear, so to speak, Abraham, for God accomplishing this restoring, renewing, ingathering work. And he gives Abraham, he advances that program with Abraham in the people of Israel, the great nation that he brings forth, Israel again as the covenant household of Abraham. So they are to be then that instrument through which this is to come about, this gathering back to himself of the alienated human race. And Israel's failure to be the Abrahamic people then becomes this great point of calamity and tension in the story, because God says, what I promised to Abraham, I haven't changed that. And once Israel fails as the Abrahamic people, and it becomes clear that they cannot fulfill their election and their calling, then we have a problem. And either God has to come up with another plan, a new plan for the world, or his plan that he's bound up in Abraham by covenant just will fail, and that'll be the end of the story. Or somehow God has to make the Abrahamic family be what they were chosen and called to be, so that his promises to Abraham, his promises to Abraham and through Abraham to the whole world of the human world, so that that covenantal promise and pledge can come to pass. And that's what he ends up doing. And that's ultimately where we see this is going through the prophets, is that God will cause the Abrahamic people, the seed of Abraham, to be what they were chosen and covenanted to be in the first place. And this brings us into that Messianic work. So Abraham is crucially important, and David sits within that Abrahamic promise, Israelite covenant obligation. David is, as the king of Israel, he's son of God par excellence. He's the son, a son of Abraham par excellence. If Israel is to be the light of the nation, son of God for the sake of the world, their king is especially supposed to be that. And David himself fails, as we've seen in that regard. But God also bound up in David the future of this Abrahamic promise, a kingdom, greatness, glory, God ruling over all the families of the earth, gathering all things back to himself. He also connects that with this son who is to come from David. David is a son of Abraham, right? A descendant. And David is to have a son. So this is all still connecting through this Israelite people. And that's why when the gospel writers start telling the Jesus story, they so much focus on Abraham and David. I mentioned Matthew's genealogy. And, when John the Baptist is born, and we'll get there, but Zacharias, John's father, he's a priest, and Zacharias' benediction, filled with the Spirit, he talks about how now the birth of this forerunner means the Messiah is at hand, and that represents God raising up in the house of David a deliverer, a savior, a redeemer. And this is his showing of his faithfulness to keep his oath to Abraham, the covenant he made with Abraham, the oath he swore to the fathers. So even Zacharias, in recognizing that this is the time of the Messiah, he sees that as God keeping his promise to Abraham and to David. So these guys are crucially important, Abraham and David, in the progress of the salvation history, the progress of the covenants in the salvation history, and ultimately the way all of that converges on Jesus himself. And so obviously this is a key theme in the prophets as well.
Like, I want to read a part as we wrap up our episode and we kind of tie in like our last key section. But it says that the developing Messianic revelation was the centerpiece of the prophetic word. All of the concerns and components of the prophet's messages came together in the promise of a future deliverance and restoration in connection with the royal son promised to David. One of the last things that we really wanted to unpack under this idea of kind of God's prophets, and ultimately how they almost were kind of his mouthpiece in terms of speaking to this future reality, was that Israel was going to be the bearer of the Messiah to his kid. Like, as we kind of help our listeners and watchers understand, what are some key things that they need to have in their backpack? Because this will be our last episode as we ultimately kind of cross that bridge and we start engaging in the New Testament context, et cetera. What are some things that they need to have in their backpack as we kind of commence that journey?
Well, I think that idea of Israel as the bearer of the Messiah is a crucial idea. And I think most people would say, yeah, we get that. Jesus was a Jew. Okay, that's fine and good. Well, we're saying much more than that. And again, I guess I would point our listeners back to the servant songs in Isaiah. Because what Isaiah does is he, again, as the prophets did, he points to the Abrahamic people. He points to, and at that point you have still Israel in the north and Judah in the south, but he points to this family of Abraham, these Israelite people, and he reminds them of how they have failed the covenant. And he defines the Israelite people, the Abrahamic people, in terms of these designations of Israel is a son, Israel is a servant, Yahweh's servant. Israel is to be a disciple. To fulfill its servanthood, it has to be a disciple, a faithful disciple. A disciple's a learner, someone who sits at the feet of the teacher and listens and learns and gets shaped by the master or the teacher so that the disciple becomes like the master or the teacher. So Israel is to be a disciple of Yahweh, to be shaped into the likeness and to the mind and to the understanding, to become Yahweh shaped, as it were, in order that now, as servant of Yahweh, they can fulfill this fourth thing, which is to be the witness of Yahweh to the nations. Israel is son, servant, disciple, and witness. And what Isaiah does is define Israel in all those ways, but show how they have failed in all those ways. Israel is an unfaithful son that doesn't know its father. Israel is an unfaithful servant. Israel has followed after other masters, other gods. Israel has not been faithful to its master, to its God. And Israel has had stopped ears. They don't listen. They're an unfaithful, they're really a worthless disciple. And so ultimately, then Israel has not been a witness according to its Abrahamic election. It has not been the witness of Yahweh to the world. It has actually stood with the world in it's in solidarity, as people alienated and estranged from the God of all mankind. They have joined the nations in actually reviling and blaspheming and being contrary to God. They haven't brought the nations to God. They've joined the nations in standing against God. And out of that indictment of Israel comes these 4 servant songs. They're short poems. There's one in chapter 42 of Isaiah, 49, 50, and then the end of 52 into 53. And I think we all know Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage. Everybody recognizes that as Messianic. But that's the 4th of the 4 servant songs. And what those servant songs do is they talk about how God is going to raise up a servant Israel, but a servant who will be a faithful disciple, who will have the ears of disciples, a servant who will be filled with the Spirit, who will minister the power and the life of the Spirit in the world. Israel had the Spirit dwelling in their midst, and they were to be empowered and led and cared for. They were the people of the Spirit. Well, now God is saying, I'm bringing a servant who I will put my Spirit upon him, and he will bring justice, and he will be this, and he will be that. Well, also, particularly in chapter 49, this servant Israel is to be the servant through whom God will restore and reconstitute, bring back together Israel. You are my servant Israel, in order that through you I might restore Israel. But it's not enough that you should be my servant on behalf of the preserved ones of Israel and Judah. I will make you a light of the nations, right? I will make you a covenant of the people, so that my salvation, my deliverance will go to the ends of the earth. So this servant in the servant songs comes up out of Israel, and he is Israel in truth. He's the son, servant, disciple, witness that Israel never was. But God will use this servant that comes out of Israel to restore and reconstitute Israel, so that now Israel can fulfill its Abrahamic mandate to be the light of the nations. And so God says, it's not enough that you should just be my servant for the sake of Israel, but through you I will take my salvation to the ends of the earth. This is the way in which this idea of Messiah, or Israel as the bearer of the Messiah, is treated in the scriptures. And even when we get to this issue of incarnation, we're going to spend a lot of time on that, because it's very important to see that in biblical terms, and not just simply, okay, fully God, fully man, stick them together. But this is something that I think is going to be crucially foundational to our audience in terms of being prepared for the birth of Jesus, and what it means that he comes out of Israel, and how he is really the essence of Israel for the sake of Israel. This is going to be important in understanding the 4 gospel accounts as well, and how Jesus then becomes the light of the nations in and through this early reconstituted people that he builds around himself and his disciples.
This concludes part 2 of our rest stop number 4 on the Messianic foundations and setting the stage for Jesus' birth. We hope that not only this episode, but hopefully you had a chance to listen to part 1, have been profitable, not only in terms of just taking a pause on our journey, but just really synthesizing where we've been for essentially like the last year and a half. Kit and I have tried to labor and intentionally make sure that we hold our audience's hand through these very complex ideas, which are critical to a right understanding. And once again, Kit, one of the things that I'm walking away with, and I hope our listeners are, is that this idea of a new covenant is not a New Testament idea,
Right.
but that these things are deeply rooted in Israel's history, in salvation history. And as you've always said, anytime we're confused, start where we always should, at the beginning. And
Right.
so once again, thank you so much for listening, for following along with this. We hope that you have your backpack as we move forward on our journey. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.